After the accident, everything Thomas had believed to be certain dissolved into something hazy and half-forgotten, like breath on cold glass. He was 24 and already felt ancient, his left leg ached with every change in the weather, his lungs burned if he climbed too fast, and in his eyes lived the dull quiet of someone who had spent too much time listening to beeping monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. When the hospital finally discharged him, it was not to a warm apartment of his own or a girlfriend's arms, but to the worn creak of his childhood home, where his father lived with a woman Thomas still struggled to call his stepmother. Clara had been married to his father for 5 years, but her presence was like that of a winter sun, low, gentle, and distant. She was beautiful, yes, in that poised, self-contained way that deflected attention more than it invited it. She wore silk blouses that whispered when she moved, and always had a book half-read on the side table. Thomas remembered her vaguely from the few visits home between college semesters and odd jobs out of state, how she barely spoke, how she always smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. His father, Richard, was absent more often than not. A traveling consultant for some firm Thomas never quite understood, his life had become a calendar of flights and hotels. He'd come home every third weekend, sometimes less, and those visits were mostly silent affairs, punctuated by stilted dinners and awkward attempts at conversation. Clara remained, ghost-like but graceful, managing the household as if it were her only tether to the world. She said little to Thomas in those first days, only nodding gently when he arrived, showing him to his old room without fanfare. The sheets had been changed. The walls repainted a soft, forgettable gray. His posters were gone. It felt like a space waiting to forget him again. Time passed strangely in that house. Mornings came slow, the sun filtering through gauzy curtains, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. Thomas spent the first few weeks in silence, healing, physically, but also from something deeper. Sometimes he sat outside on the porch and listened to birds, trying not to think about the sound of tires skidding, metal bending, bones cracking. Clara was always there, in the periphery. He'd find her in the kitchen in the early afternoon, slicing apples with the kind of precision that made it seem like ritual. She drank her coffee black. She listened to music on an old record player, Debussy, Satie, Rachmaninoff, and always at a volume low enough to be mistaken for wind. It began with glances. In the hallway, across the kitchen, beside the bookshelf where their fingertips once brushed over the same copy of The Stranger. Her eyes were green, but pale, like faded sea glass. There was a weight behind them, something unspoken. Not sadness exactly, something else. Hunger, maybe. Loneliness, more likely. Thomas, still limping, still wrapped in the quiet fog of recovery, noticed her in a way he never had before. Not just as the woman who married his father, but as a presence, delicate, deliberate, undeniably real. Their conversations were rare but longer each time. They spoke about music. The weather at first, Clara avoided any mention of Richard, as though speaking his name might disturb whatever fragile peace had settled in the rooms. Thomas followed her lead. Then came the confidences, soft, hesitant. Clara shared that she had once wanted to be a pianist, before she met Richard, before life shifted her towards something more practical, more acceptable. She had studied at a conservatory in Paris for 2 years. She rarely played now, she said, because the house was too quiet, and she hated hearing the sound of a single mistake echo through it. Thomas listened. He didn't press her. And perhaps because of that, she told him more. About how lonely it could be to live with someone who was never there. About how silence, when prolonged, could become a kind of violence. And Thomas? He told her about the crash. Not the details, the rain, the drunk driver, the scream, but the after. The silence of the hospital room. The smell of antiseptic and the way the world seemed to move too fast for him now. How his friends stopped calling after the second month. How even pain, after a while, starts to feel like company. Clara didn't interrupt. She didn't offer platitudes or advice. She simply listened, and in her listening, Thomas felt less like a patient and more like a person. One evening, long after dinner, Thomas found her in the music room. It was a small space tucked near the back of the house, with dust on the windowsills and a single upright piano that hadn't been played in years. Clara was sitting on the bench, her fingers hovering above the keys but not touching them. When she saw him, she didn't startle. Instead, she slid slightly to the side and patted the bench beside her. He sat. They said nothing for a long time. Then, without warning, Clara began to play. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes, hesitant and trembling. But then it grew, swelling into something aching and lovely. Thomas closed his eyes. He didn't recognize the piece, but it didn't matter. The music filled the silence that had clung to the house for weeks, breaking it like glass. When he opened his eyes again, Clara was crying. Not sobbing, just tears slipping down her face in silence. She didn't stop playing. That night changed something between them. Unspoken, but undeniable. After that night, the piano became their shared secret. Clara would play in the evenings, always after the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows grew long and soft. Sometimes Thomas would sit beside her, sometimes he would listen from the hallway, not wanting to intrude but unable to stay away. It wasn't always classical. Sometimes she played jazz, broken melodies that felt like confessions. Other times, she let her hands drift into improvisation, notes floating and falling like leaves. Thomas never spoke when she played. He simply listened, as though each song she gave him was a fragile gift that would vanish if named. And Clara, in turn, began to look at him differently. There was warmth now, where once there had only been courtesy. When their eyes met, they held. Their conversations deepened. They spoke of dreams abandoned, of roads not taken. Thomas told her about the girl he'd almost proposed to, before the accident fractured everything. Clara spoke of the child she had wanted but never had, and how sometimes, late at night, she still felt the absence like a phantom limb. They didn't touch, not at first. But their proximity was its own language. The brush of hands exchanging coffee cups. The shared quiet of long walks through the orchard behind the house. The way she lingered when she passed him in the hallway. It was not passion. Not yet, it was longing, slow and reverent, like a prayer whispered into a church empty of gods. One afternoon, Clara brought down a photo album from the attic. She laid it on the table and invited Thomas to sit beside her. Page after page revealed frozen moments from a life he had never really known, wedding photos, snapshots from vacations he had never attended, images of his father smiling in ways Thomas could barely remember. Clara was in nearly every picture, always poised, always elegant, always slightly apart. Even in images where she was laughing, there was a kind of distance in her eyes, as if her joy never fully touched the surface. When they reached the last page, Clara closed the album and placed her hand over his. "You look so much like him," she said softly, her thumb brushing lightly against his skin. "But you're not him, you see me." Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The space between them pulsed with something raw and unspoken. Clara stood, slowly, and walked to the kitchen. When she returned, she had a glass of wine for herself and tea for him. They sat together until the sky turned violet, and the first stars pierced through the dark. The next night, Clara didn't play the piano. Instead, she asked Thomas if he wanted to learn. Surprised, he nodded. She sat behind him, guiding his hands with hers, her voice soft against his ear. The contact was electric. Not overt. Not sexual. But charged with a kind of intimacy that left them both breathless. When he hit a wrong note, she laughed, really laughed, for the first time since he'd returned. It was a beautiful sound, like glass chiming. And then, one evening, it happened. Clara had been playing a piece Thomas had heard before, a gentle, melancholy melody that always seemed to slow time. He stood in the doorway, watching her. The light from the lamp caught her hair, giving her the appearance of something ethereal. When she finished, she looked up at him. Neither of them moved. And then, slowly, Clara rose from the bench. She walked to him, stopping just inches away. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, and brushed against his cheek. Thomas didn't pull away. "Tell me to stop," she whispered. But he didn't. Their kiss was slow, unsure, as if they both expected to wake from a dream. When they finally parted, the silence returned, but it was different now. It carried weight meaning. Clara stepped back, eyes filled with something between fear and desire. Thomas, breathing hard, looked away. "I shouldn't have," she said. "I know," he replied. But neither of them walked away. What followed was not a torrid affair but a slow unraveling. They continued to pretend during the day, polite conversations, shared meals, small talk. But at night, in the shadows of the house, they found each other. In touches. In glances. In quiet confessions whispered in the dark. They never crossed certain lines. But the lines themselves became blurry, shifting with each passing day. Then one evening, the inevitable knock on the door. Richard had returned. Unannounced. His suitcase in hand, his voice booming as he entered. Clara froze. Thomas stepped back, heart racing. The house once theirs reverted instantly. The silence became suffocating again, filled with unsaid things and barely buried truths. Richard greeted his son with a handshake. Kissed his wife on the cheek. He didn't notice the tension. Or if he did, he chose not to name it. That night, Clara did not come to the piano. She remained in the bedroom with the door closed. Thomas sat alone, the silence louder than any music.